You have 30 days to vacate the house, Lauren said softly at the reading of the will, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of erasing a 72-year-old widow from her own life. The words settled over the polished oak conference table like dust. Evelyn Carter did not flinch. She did not look at her daughter-in-law. She simply folded her hands in her lap and kept her back straight in the leather chair at the far end of the room. The office of attorney Michael Bennett overlooked a gray Boston street, late October light filtering through tall windows, thin and cold. The radiator clicked softly beneath the window. Papers rustled. Daniel Carter cleared his throat but did not speak. The scent of old books and fresh coffee lingered in the air, a strange contrast to the tension pressing against the walls. Michael adjusted his glasses and continued reading from the document in a careful, neutral tone. The estate of Richard Carter, including the family home in Brookline, the investment accounts, and the vacation property in Cape Cod, was to be transferred in full to his only son, Daniel Carter. A reasonable provision, Michael added gently, had been included for Mrs. Evelyn Carter. She would retain the right to reside in the primary residence for 30 days following the reading. 30 days. After 48 years of marriage, after decades spent sanding hardwood floors, repainting shutters, hosting Thanksgiving dinners for 20 people in that very dining room, 30 days felt like a storage unit rental. Evelyn kept her gaze on the grain of the table. She traced the thin line in the wood with her eyes, steady and unblinking. Lauren reached for Daniel's hand, squeezing it with quiet triumph. She wore a tailored navy suit, her blonde hair pulled back neatly, her expression arranged into something that might have passed for sympathy. "We'll help you find something comfortable," Lauren added, her voice smooth. "Maybe a nice condo. Less maintenance. Less stress." Daniel nodded quickly, still avoiding his mother's eyes. Evelyn noticed the way his jaw tightened, the way he shifted in his seat like a boy caught between teachers. She remembered the first time he had ridden a bicycle without training wheels, how he had looked back at her for approval before pedaling forward. Now he looked everywhere but at her. Michael paused, glancing up briefly. "That concludes the primary. Distribution," he said. Silence followed. Outside, a delivery truck idled at the curb. Somewhere down the hall, a copier hummed. Evelyn inhaled slowly. The air felt thinner than usual, as if the room had quietly reduced its oxygen. She had worn black that day, not out of performance, but habit. Richard had been gone for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of condolence casseroles, of sympathy cards stacked on the kitchen counter, of evenings spent sitting in his armchair listening to the clock tick in the hallway. He had promised her, more than once, that she would be protected. "Everything is arranged, Evie," he had said one night, his hand warm over hers. She had believed him. Across the table, Lauren shifted in her seat, tapping a manicured finger lightly against the folder in front of her. "It's what Dad would have wanted," she said carefully, as if rehearsed. Evelyn finally lifted her eyes, not to argue, not to accuse, but to look at her son fully. Daniel's expression flickered, guilt, discomfort, calculation, then settled into something firmer. "It makes sense, Mom," he murmured. "The house is a lot for one person. The house, not her home. Not the place where she had measured Daniel's height against the pantry door frame every September. Not the kitchen where she had stood at 5 in the morning packing lunches and signing permission slips. Just square footage and property taxes." Evelyn nodded once, slowly, as if agreeing with a minor detail in a conversation about the weather. She reached for her handbag and closed it with deliberate calm. If Lauren expected tears, she would not have them. If Daniel expected protest, he would not hear it. In that quiet office, under fluorescent lights and the watchful gaze of framed law degrees, Evelyn Carter understood something with sudden clarity. This was not the moment her family began their revenge. This was simply the moment they believed they had won. The elevator ride down from the law office felt longer than it had on the way up, as if gravity itself had grown heavier in the span of 40 minutes. Evelyn stood between Daniel and Lauren, close enough to feel the faint scent of Lauren's perfume, distant enough to sense the deliberate space her son maintained. No one spoke. The numbers above the door blinked slowly from 5 to 4 to 3. When the doors opened into the marble lobby, Daniel cleared his throat and said they would follow her home to talk about next steps. Next steps. The phrase sounded like something from a corporate meeting, not the dismantling of a marriage that had lasted nearly half a century. Evelyn told them that would not be necessary. Her voice was even, almost gentle. She preferred to drive alone. Outside, the air carried the sharp edge of late October. A thin wind moved along the sidewalk, stirring fallen leaves against the curb. She walked to her silver sedan, the one Richard had insisted on buying because it had the highest safety rating in its class. He had researched everything meticulously, comparing mileage, repair records, warranty coverage. He had never left details to chance. As she started the engine, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face looked composed, almost detached, but her eyes held something steadier than grief. The drive back to Brookline took 20 minutes. She passed the bakery where Richard used to stop on Sunday mornings for cinnamon rolls, the hardware store where he had once spent an entire afternoon debating paint finishes. The town looked unchanged, indifferent to private catastrophes. When she turned onto their street, the house stood exactly as it always had, white siding, black shutters, the maple tree in the front yard shedding leaves across the lawn. For a moment she remained in the car, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. 30 days. She imagined cardboard boxes stacked in the hallway, strangers measuring windows, Lauren discussing renovations in a tone that suggested improvement rather than erasure. Inside, the house greeted her with silence. The faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway marked each second with mechanical patience. She removed her coat and hung it on the same brass hook she had used for years. In the kitchen, a casserole dish from a neighbor still sat on the counter, covered in foil. Condolences, delivered warm and well-intentioned, now cold and untouched. She walked through the room slowly, not to mourn but to observe. The living room still held Richard's reading glasses on the side table, a bookmark tucked halfway through his novel. The dining room table bore faint scratches from decades of holiday meals. She ran her fingers over one of them, remembering the year Daniel had spilled cranberry sauce and panicked, as if he had committed a crime. She had laughed then and told him what could survive much worse. In the master bedroom, sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, illuminating the quilt she had stitched by hand 20 years earlier. Richard had stood beside her at the county fair when it won second place. He had said first place was clearly political. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly under her weight. Michael Bennett's careful tone echoed in her mind. Primary distribution. Reasonable provision. She considered the phrasing. Richard had never used language that thin when speaking about her future. He had spoken plainly, with certainty. She rose and crossed to his desk in the corner, the one Daniel had once called outdated. In the top drawer lay a stack of neatly organized folders. Bank statements. Insurance policies. Notes in Richard's steady handwriting. Evelyn did not open them yet. She simply rested her hand on the drawer and felt, beneath the quiet of the house, a subtle shift. Daniel and Lauren believed the matter was settled, reduced to signatures and timelines. But Evelyn had shared a life with a man who planned for storms long before clouds appeared. And as the late afternoon light stretched across the bedroom floor, she began to suspect that what had been read aloud in that polished office might not have been the final word. The house grew quieter as evening settled over Brookline, the last of the sunlight fading from gold to gray across the hardwood floors. Evelyn remained by Richard's desk, her hand still resting on the drawer, as if it held a pulse she could feel through the wood. She pulled it open slowly. Inside, everything was arranged with the precision she had come to expect from him. Folders labeled in black ink. Dates written carefully in the top right corners. Nothing chaotic. Nothing rushed. She lifted the first folder and carried it to the bed, sitting upright against the headboard as she opened it. Insurance policies, current and paid in full. Account summaries printed only a month before his passing. She studied the numbers without flinching. She had balanced this household budget for decades. She knew the rhythm of their finances the way other people knew song lyrics. What she read did not align with what had been presented that morning. The primary investment account had been moved into a trust 18 months earlier. She remembered that conversation now. Richard had insisted they meet with Michael Bennett on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He had squeezed her hand under the table and said, everything must be clear. She had trusted him, as she always had. The trust documents lay beneath the account statements, clipped together. Evelyn adjusted her glasses and read each page carefully. The trust was structured with contingencies, conditions written in firm language. She felt a quiet shift in her chest. Not relief exactly, but recognition. Richard had not been a man who left his wife dependent on kindness. Downstairs, a car door closed. Through the bedroom window, she saw Daniel's SUV pull into the driveway. Headlights swept briefly across the front lawn before switching off. Lauren stepped out first, her posture straight, her movements brisk. Daniel followed more slowly. Evelyn closed the folder and returned it to the drawer, restoring everything to its exact place. She descended the staircase with steady steps, the grandfather clock marking each second. When she opened the front door, Lauren was already halfway up the walkway. "We thought we should talk tonight," Lauren said, her tone polished, as if offering assistance. Daniel lingered a step behind. Evelyn invited them inside. The living room lights cast a warm glow over familiar furniture. No one sat at first. Lauren glanced around the room with a measuring eye, the way she had once evaluated kitchen remodel ideas in glossy magazines. Daniel finally lowered himself onto the edge of the sofa. "Mom," he began carefully, "we need to think about what is practical." Practical. The word seemed to echo in the room. Evelyn chose the armchair opposite them, the one Richard had favored in the evenings. She folded her hands calmly. "Practical for whom?" she asked, her voice neither sharp nor soft. Daniel hesitated. Lauren answered instead. "The house is valuable. In this market, it could sell for well over $1.5 million. That could secure our future and yours. Our future and yours." The distinction lingered in the air. Evelyn watched her son's face. He did not correct his wife. He did not disagree. She nodded slowly, as if considering a suggestion about landscaping. "Richard always valued preparation," she said quietly. "He believed in long-term thinking." Lauren smiled faintly. "Exactly." Evelyn studied her daughter-in-law for a moment longer, then shifted her gaze back to Daniel. "Did your father ever tell you about the trust?" she asked. Daniel blinked. "What trust?" The room seemed to contract slightly. Lauren's expression tightened for a fraction of a second before smoothing again. Evelyn did not elaborate. She simply observed the confusion crossing her son's features. In that small flicker of uncertainty, she saw something she had not seen earlier in the law office. Not triumph, not control, but a gap in the story he believed. And as the clock continued its steady ticking in the hallway, Evelyn understood that the document read aloud that morning might have been only one layer of a much deeper design. Daniel looked at his mother as if she had just spoken in a language he had never learned. "What trust?" he repeated, leaning forward slightly on the sofa. Lauren did not move, but her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag resting on her lap. Evelyn noticed that small detail. She had spent decades reading subtle shifts in posture across dinner tables and school auditoriums. She recognized tension when it entered a room. "Your father believed in safeguards," Evelyn said calmly. "He did not like loose ends." She kept her tone measured, not accusing, not triumphant. Daniel frowned. "Mom, the attorney went through everything this morning." Lauren nodded quickly. If there were something else, it would have been presented. Evelyn held Lauren's gaze for a quiet moment. "Not necessarily," she replied. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the half hour, the sound steady and unhurried. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a habit he had never outgrown. "Are you saying there is another document?" he asked. Evelyn did not answer directly. Instead, she rose from her chair and walked toward the dining room. Daniel and Lauren exchanged a brief look before following. The dining table still bore faint water rings from years of family gatherings. Evelyn placed her hand on the back of one of the chairs, steadying herself not from weakness but from intention. "Your father and I met with Michael Bennett last year," she said. "On a Tuesday afternoon. It was raining. You were in Chicago for work." Daniel tried to recall the timeline, his brow tightening. Lauren's expression remained composed, but her eyes sharpened. "He wanted to update certain structures," Evelyn continued. "He said circumstances change. People change." The sentence lingered in the air longer than the others. Daniel shifted his weight. "Why would he not tell me?" he asked. And there was a trace of something in his voice that had not been there before. Not authority, not certainty, something closer to doubt. Evelyn looked at her son fully. "Perhaps he intended to," she said softly. "Or perhaps he believed actions speak more clearly than explanations." Lauren crossed her arms loosely, a defensive posture disguised as patience. "With respect," she said, Until we see something in writing, this feels hypothetical. The word hypothetical sounded clinical, detached from the life that had unfolded inside these walls. Evelyn nodded once. I agree, she said. Documents matter. She turned and walked toward the staircase. Daniel hesitated only a second before following. Lauren trailed behind, her heels clicking lightly against the hardwood floor. In the bedroom, Evelyn moved to Richard's desk and opened the top drawer with unhurried precision. She removed a thin folder, beige and unremarkable, and held it without offering it yet. Daniel watched her hands. Lauren watched her face. Evelyn opened the folder and scanned the first page, as if confirming something she already knew. Then she extended it toward her son. Daniel stepped forward and took it carefully. His eyes moved across the page, reading silently at first, then more slowly. Lauren leaned closer, her shoulder brushing his. The room felt smaller now, the late evening light dimming behind the curtains. Daniel swallowed. This is dated 18 months ago, he said quietly. It references a trust structure. Evelyn remained still. Yes, she answered. Lauren's eyes moved rapidly across the legal language. Her composure flickered, just for a moment. It says here that the trust holds the primary investment account, she murmured. Daniel looked up at his mother, confusion deepening. But that was not part of the estate summary. Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation. No, she said. It was not. Silence settled heavily between them. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked once and then stopped. Daniel continued reading, his breathing more measured now. Lauren straightened, recalculating. Evelyn observed them both with the same patience she had once used while teaching Daniel how to balance a checkbook at the kitchen counter. She did not rush. She did not explain further. She understood something they were only beginning to realize. What had been presented that morning was not the full picture. And as Daniel's expression shifted from certainty to unease, Evelyn felt the quiet confirmation that Richard had not left her unprotected after all. Daniel read the final page twice before lowering the document, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something simpler. Lauren leaned closer, her shoulder tense, her eyes scanning the clauses she had not anticipated. The bedroom felt smaller now, the air heavier, the quiet more deliberate. It says the trust becomes irrevocable upon death, Daniel said slowly, and that the trustee has full discretion over distribution. He looked up at his mother. You are the trustee. Evelyn inclined her head once. Your father insisted, she said. Her voice carried no triumph, only clarity. Lauren straightened, smoothing the front of her jacket as if regaining composure required physical alignment. That does not change the house, she said carefully. The will was clear about the property. Evelyn watched her daughter-in-law without blinking. Continue reading, she said. Daniel obeyed. His eyes moved further down the page, to a section labeled Contingency Provisions. The legal language grew denser, more specific. His breathing slowed as comprehension settled in stages. In the event that any beneficiary attempts to remove, pressure, or otherwise coerce the surviving spouse to vacate the primary residence within a period deemed unreasonable by the trustee, he read, his voice thinning slightly. The trustee reserves the authority to withhold discretionary distributions from said beneficiary. The room seemed to absorb the sentence and hold it suspended. Lauren's posture stiffened. That is a standard protective clause, she said quickly. It does not apply here. Evelyn did not respond. She had learned long ago that silence often invited truth to reveal itself without interference. Daniel continued reading. Discretionary distributions include supplemental transfers, early access to investment growth, and conditional releases for property acquisition. He looked up again. Lauren, that is the account we plan to use for the down payment on the new place in Newton. Lauren's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The certainty that had accompanied her into the house began to recede. We were counting on that flexibility, Daniel added quietly, more to himself than to either woman. Evelyn walked to the window and parted the curtain slightly. Outside, the streetlights had come on, casting long shadows across the lawn. She remembered the afternoon Richard had returned from the attorney's office with a quiet satisfaction. In his eyes, he had poured 2 cups of coffee and said, "No one corners you in your own home." She had not asked for details then. She had trusted the tone in his voice. Behind her, Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, Why did you not mention this earlier? Evelyn turned back toward them. You did not ask, she replied gently. The answer was simple, almost clinical. Lauren exhaled slowly, recalculating again. This does not mean we are trying to pressure you, she said. We were discussing options. Evelyn stepped closer, her gaze steady but not hostile. You gave me a timeline this morning, she said. 30 days. The number settled between them like a marker on a calendar that no longer felt negotiable. Daniel looked down at the folder in his hands. That was based on what we were told, he said. We did not know. Evelyn studied her son's face. She saw confusion, perhaps regret, but also the dawning awareness that decisions made in confidence might carry consequences. The trust document remained open in his hands, the ink dry and unyielding. Your father prepared for possibilities, Evelyn said quietly. He believed that security should not depend on goodwill alone. Lauren pressed her lips together, then forced a measured smile that did not reach her eyes. We should review this with Michael, she said. There may be interpretations. Evelyn nodded. You are welcome to do that. She extended her hand, and Daniel returned the folder to her without resistance. She placed it back into the drawer and closed it with deliberate care. The soft click of wood meeting wood sounded final in the quiet room. As Daniel and Lauren stood there, adjusting to a landscape that had subtly shifted beneath them, Evelyn felt something settle into place inside her. Not vengeance, not anger, something steadier. The realization that the ground beneath her feet was firmer than anyone in that house had assumed. Daniel and Lauren left the house with far less certainty than they had carried in. The front door closed softly behind them, and the sound echoed through the hallway with restrained finality. Evelyn stood still for a moment, listening to the engine of their vehicle start, idle, and finally fade down the quiet suburban street. She did not follow them to the window this time. She already understood the shift that had taken place. The house felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the illusion of control had dissolved. She returned to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, her hand steady against the cool surface of the counter. The clock above the stove read 8:45. Only a few hours had passed since the reading at the law office, yet the day felt stretched across years. She carried the glass into the living room and sat in Richard's armchair, the leather worn gently at the arms from decades of evenings spent reading financial journals and local newspapers. She allowed herself a slow breath. She was not celebrating. She was not grieving. She was recalibrating. The conversation upstairs replayed in her mind, each sentence examined with the same care she once used when reviewing monthly statements. Lauren's quick assertions, Daniel's confusion, the unmistakable flicker of dependence when he realized the trust controlled more than he had anticipated. Evelyn had never wanted power over her son. She had wanted security beside her husband. There was a difference, and she felt it clearly now. Her gaze moved to the framed photograph on the mantel. Richard stood beside her in that image, taken at their 40th wedding anniversary party. He had insisted on hosting it in the backyard, stringing white lights between the maple tree and the fence, grilling steaks himself despite the July heat. He had toasted her in front of 50 friends and family members, calling her the foundation of everything stable in his life. She remembered the way Lauren had applauded politely that night, already evaluating the guest list, the catering, the value of appearances. Evelyn stood and walked back upstairs to the desk. She opened the drawer again and removed a second folder she had not shown earlier. This one was thinner, containing correspondence between Richard and Michael Bennett. Letters printed on firm letterhead, dated in precise order. She read one paragraph carefully. It referenced an amendment to be disclosed only under specific circumstances, with language that suggested discretion rather than secrecy. Evelyn did not yet know whether those circumstances had fully matured, but she recognized the pattern. Richard had layered his planning, building protections like the foundation beneath a house. She closed the folder and returned it to its place. Downstairs, the house settled with soft creaks as the temperature shifted. She walked into the master bedroom and opened the closet, brushing her hand lightly across Richard's jackets. The scent of his cologne lingered faintly in the fabric. He had trusted her judgment. That trust now required clarity, not hesitation. Her phone vibrated softly on the nightstand. A message from Daniel appeared on the screen. We should meet with Michael tomorrow. I need to understand everything. She read it once, and placed the phone back down without responding immediately. Understanding required patience, and patience was something she possessed in abundance. She moved to the window and looked out at the darkened street. The maple tree swayed gently under the streetlight, leaves scattering across the lawn she had tended every spring. 30 days had been presented as a deadline. Now it felt like a suggestion spoken too soon. Evelyn rested her hand against the cool glass and allowed herself one quiet thought that carried neither anger nor fear. The rules of the game had shifted, and for the first time since Richard's passing, she was no longer the one being evaluated. She was the one holding the terms. The next morning arrived with a pale wash of winter light creeping across the Carter home, quiet and restrained. Evelyn had risen before sunrise, as she had done for most of her adult life. Habit did not disappear simply because circumstances shifted. She brewed coffee in the same machine Richard had insisted was worth the extra expense because it maintained a consistent temperature. She poured one cup for herself and set another mug on the counter out of instinct before remembering there was no one to claim it. She left it there for a moment anyway. At 9:15, her phone rang. Michael Bennett's name appeared on the screen. She answered calmly. His voice carried professional restraint, but there was something beneath it that suggested preparedness. Daniel had contacted him earlier that morning requesting a comprehensive review of all estate structures. Michael had agreed to meet that afternoon. There are additional documents that were not addressed during the initial reading, he said carefully. Richard was specific about timing. Evelyn looked out the kitchen window at the frost still clinging to the grass. I assumed as much, she replied. Michael paused briefly before continuing. There is an amendment attached to the trust. It becomes relevant if there is any attempt to accelerate property transfer or displace you from residence without your consent. The phrasing was clinical, but the meaning was clear. Evelyn thanked him and ended the call. She did not rush. She carried her coffee into the dining room and sat at the head of the table, a seat she rarely occupied when Richard was alive. The chair felt different beneath her, not heavier, not symbolic, simply aligned. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Daniel and Lauren returned. Their steps on the front porch were measured, less confident than the night before. Evelyn greeted them with composed politeness and drove separately to Michael's office, preferring her own silence to shared speculation. The conference room looked identical to the day before, yet the atmosphere had shifted. Michael placed a new folder on the table, thicker than the previous one. Daniel leaned forward immediately. Lauren kept her expression neutral, though her posture was taut. Michael began with deliberate clarity. The trust, he explained, had been designed in layers. The primary estate distribution outlined in the will transferred titled property. However, the majority of liquid assets and long-term investment growth were secured within the trust. He turned a page. There is also a residential protection clause, he added. Daniel frowned slightly. We saw that. Michael nodded. What you saw was the discretionary withholding provision. There is an extension. He slid a document across the table toward Daniel. The amendment specified that any documented effort to pressure the surviving spouse into vacating the residence within 12 months of the grantor's death would automatically suspend all trust distributions to the initiating party for a period of 5 years. The language was precise, unemotional, unambiguous. Lauren's composure faltered almost imperceptibly. Pressure is subjective, she said carefully. Michael shook his head gently. In this case, it is defined. Written communication suggesting a timeline shorter than 1 year qualifies. The room grew very still. Daniel's eyes moved slowly across the page. Evelyn remained quiet, her hands folded lightly before her. She did not look at Lauren. She did not look at Daniel. She looked at the document the way Richard would have, evaluating structure rather than reaction. Michael continued. Richard was clear that Evelyn's residence and financial autonomy were to remain intact for at least 1 full year, without negotiation. Daniel exhaled slowly, the confidence of the previous day replaced with dawning recognition. Lauren sat straighter, recalculating once more, but the margins for adjustment had narrowed. The 30-day suggestion now existed in written contrast to a 12-month guarantee. Evelyn allowed the silence to stretch, not to intimidate, but to settle. She understood now that Richard had not simply prepared for grief. He had prepared for misjudgment. And as the afternoon light filtered through the office windows, It became unmistakably clear that the structure beneath her life was far more secure than anyone had assumed. The silence in the conference room did not break immediately after Michael finished speaking. It settled slowly, like fine dust after a structure has been tested and found stronger than expected. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the document still open in his hands, as though he needed physical proof that the words would not disappear. Lauren's posture remained upright, but the confidence that had once framed her expression had narrowed into calculation. Michael closed the folder with deliberate calm. Richard anticipated that emotions might complicate decision-making, he said evenly. He wanted clarity to prevent conflict. Evelyn observed her son rather than the attorney. She noticed the way Daniel's shoulders had lowered, the subtle shift from authority to reconsideration. The certainty he had carried into the house the night before had been replaced by something more fragile. I did not intend to create pressure, Daniel said quietly, his voice measured. He avoided the word 30, but it lingered between them regardless. Lauren spoke next, careful and composed. We were trying to be practical. Property values are strong right now. It seemed financially responsible. Evelyn regarded her daughter-in-law with steady attention. Financial responsibility does not require urgency, she said softly. Her tone was not accusatory. It was factual. Michael adjusted his glasses and added, the amendment is explicit. Any documented suggestion of relocation within 12 months activates the suspension. That includes written messages. Daniel's eyes flickered briefly toward his wife. Lauren's jaw tightened, only slightly. Evelyn remembered the text message from the night before, the language of next steps and practical timelines. She had not responded. She had not needed to. The structure had already spoken. After the meeting concluded, Daniel asked for a moment alone with his mother in the hallway outside the conference room. Lauren remained seated inside, reviewing the papers once more. The hallway lighting was softer, less clinical. Daniel faced Evelyn with a mixture of confusion and regret. Why did Dad not tell me? He asked. The question carried less accusation now and more bewilderment. Evelyn studied his face, seeing not the 45-year-old man negotiating property, but the child who once asked whether thunderstorms could break windows. Your father believed people reveal themselves under pressure, she replied quietly. He did not want assumptions. He wanted certainty. Daniel absorbed that without interruption. You think we were trying to push you out, he said. Evelyn did not rush her answer. I think timing matters, she responded. Grief requires space. Daniel nodded slowly, the edges of his certainty softening further. Inside the conference room, Lauren stood and smoothed her jacket again, the gesture habitual. When they returned, her expression was composed but restrained. We understand the 12-month condition, she said carefully. We will adjust our plans. Adjust. The words sounded different now, less strategic and more constrained. Evelyn inclined her head in acknowledgement. There was no victory in her expression, only steadiness. As they left the building together, the late afternoon air carried a crisp edge of early winter. The sky above Boston stretched pale and clear, indifferent to private recalculations. Daniel walked beside his mother for a few steps before heading toward his vehicle. We will figure this out, he said quietly. Evelyn nodded once. Yes, she replied. She watched as Daniel and Lauren drove away, their conversation visible only in muted gestures through the windshield. Then she entered her own car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. She did not feel triumphant. She felt anchored. Richard had not built defenses out of suspicion. He had built them out of foresight. And as Evelyn pulled onto the road and headed back toward the house that remained undeniably hers, she understood that patience, not confrontation, had shifted the balance. The next moves would not require raised voices. They would require time. And time, for the first time since the reading, was entirely on her side. The house welcomed Evelyn back with the same quiet dignity it had held for nearly 5 decades. The late afternoon light filtered through the front windows, casting long, calm shadows across the hardwood floor. She placed her keys in the ceramic bowl near the door and removed her coat slowly, as if returning from an ordinary errand rather than a meeting that had quietly redrawn the boundaries of her future. In the kitchen, she set water to boil for tea instead of coffee this time. The simple act felt deliberate, a small shift to mark a larger one. The kettle hummed softly as she stood at the counter, looking out at the maple tree in the yard. A few remaining leaves clung stubbornly to its branches, though winter was pressing in. She understood that kind of resilience. Her phone vibrated gently on the counter. A message from Daniel appeared again. "I am sorry if we made you feel rushed. That was not my intention." She read the words carefully. They were more measured now, stripped of earlier confidence. She placed the phone face down without replying immediately. Apologies offered under new information carried a different weight than apologies offered from conviction. She poured her tea and carried the mug into the living room, settling once more into Richard's armchair. The leather felt familiar beneath her hands. She allowed her gaze to move across the room slowly, from the framed photographs to the bookshelves Richard had built himself on a long weekend nearly 20 years ago. Each object carried memory, but none of them felt fragile. Upstairs, in the desk drawer, the trust documents rested in quiet order. They were not weapons. They were structure. Evelyn understood now that what had unfolded over the past 2 days had not been an attack as much as a revelation. Pressure had exposed assumptions. Assumptions had revealed intentions. She rose after finishing her tea and walked into the dining room. The table stood centered beneath the chandelier, steady and unchanged. She ran her hand lightly along its surface, remembering holiday meals, arguments that resolved themselves, laughter that filled the space. Families evolved, motives shifted, but foundations, when built carefully, endured stress. Later that evening, Daniel called instead of texting. His voice sounded less guarded. "Mom, I have been thinking," he said. "We moved too quickly." She listened without interruption. "Lauren and I were focused on logistics," he continued. "We forgot the timing." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, not in fatigue but in acknowledgement. "Timing is part of respect," she replied calmly. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I understand that now," Daniel said quietly. She did not lecture him. She did not revisit the 30-day suggestion. The documents had already spoken more clearly than any argument could. After the call ended, she walked upstairs and opened the bedroom window slightly, allowing cool air to enter the room. The neighborhood was peaceful, streetlights glowing softly against the darkening sky. She stood there for a moment, breathing in the crisp air. The house did not feel temporary. It did not feel threatened. It felt grounded. Richard had anticipated storms not because he expected betrayal, but because he believed in preparation. And preparation had done what emotion could not. It had restored balance without confrontation. Evelyn closed the window and turned off the bedside lamp. As she lay down, the events of the week arranged themselves in her mind with new clarity. There had been no shouting, no dramatic declarations, no doors slammed in anger. There had only been structure meeting assumption. In the quiet darkness of the room she had shared with her husband for nearly half a century, Evelyn allowed herself one steady conclusion. They had believed the matter was settled the moment the will was read aloud. They had believed she would accept the outline placed before her without question. But what they had mistaken for vulnerability had always been patience. And patience, when supported by foresight, does not collapse under pressure. It waits, and then it stands.